Benvenuti, welcome everyone. We waited a couple of minutes after 4, which was the time we indicated in our publicity because it's raining in Torino and we wanted to give everyone the opportunity to get here. I am going to introduce our speaker in a moment. I want to say that this is the last event in a long series of individual seminars and workshops that started 2 years ago, in 2022, for this particular cycle of the Torino Humanities Program, the body of political thought in Europe and East Asia. And I am really delighted that we are closing the series of events in Turin with Dan Smail. Dan is one of 2 visiting professors that are associated with this project. The other one is Hilde de Beert. She also gave a paper here in Turin at the beginning of the project. And one of the reasons why I asked Dan if he was interested in collaborating briefly with us and coming to Turin for the summer school in September and then again now has to do with Dan's work. I will tell you a little bit about his work. By training, Dan Smail, who is now professor of medieval history, or rather professor of history at Harvard University, is a late medievalist, and his early work has been on European late medieval history, particularly the history of Marseille and other places in southern France, but also the history of Lucca, and historical practice very much grounded in the archives, in archival work on archives, for example, court archives, or in the case of Lucca, in notarial archives and all kinds of government archives that had to do with the theme of his research, which was about debt collection. However, side by side with these sort of intensive archival, late medieval focused research, Dan has cultivated a profile as someone who can go well beyond the Middle Ages and has published some very important books. Well, one of the first books, really, one of the first monographs on the history of emotions, published in English, The Consumption of Justice, Emotions, Publicity and Legal Culture in Marseille, in 2003. But then especially a really interesting, slim but provocative book on deep history and the brain that came out in 2008, followed then by a collaboration with the anthropologist Andrew Shyrock, which has resulted in an edited volume called Deep History, the Architectural Past and Present. And this has been an attempt from the perspective of a historian to actually establish a dialogue between history and other disciplines in the humanities and social sciences about, can I say the cognitive term, or sort of new scientific acquisitions about, the very long-term view of human history. As we know, perhaps if you're familiar with incredibly popular books like Yuval Noah Harari, Sapiens, that have become sort of airport bestseller material, this has been a really interesting development where historians, and I must say especially late medieval historians by training, because Harari is also a late medieval historian by training, have actually spoken to a wider public of both colleagues but also interested readers about different perspectives on sort of historical development. Dan is continuing to cultivate his interests, and he's very interested in paleoanthropologies and in archaeology in general. And but he continues also to write history on a smaller scale. And one of the projects that he's conducting at the moment, hasn't been published yet, is indeed a microhistory of slave woman in Marseille, later emancipated in the late Middle Ages. So enough from me. When we asked Dan to prepare something for this project, there were several possible themes, but one of the themes we engaged in with methodologically, but also in the practice of our research conversations, was the problem of writing global history for the pre-modern period. This is exactly the theme that Dan has chosen to tackle this afternoon, and I'm very, very interested in listening to him on this. So the floor is yours, Dan. Writing medieval global history for thesis.
Wonderful. Thank you, Serena, for that very generous introduction.
Can you speak me out, please?
And thanks to all of you for coming out.
It's on.
Let me try this one.
See if that works. Great.
For coming out on a rainy day to hear this presentation. And for those of you who have been involved in the political thought of the body, it's just been a joy to have the chance to spend time with you and learn about your work in much more detail. There's only so much that you can learn when you come in parachuted for a day or two, when you actually sit down with people and actually talk and share ideas. It's been really exciting and interesting. And of course, to the Fondazione and the staff for bringing me here. Turin's an amazing place. I've really enjoyed my time here. I look forward to coming back. So some years ago, I was at the Medieval Academy of America meeting. This is the big group, the heartbeat or the center of medieval scholarship in the United States. It was about a decade ago. And my colleague Carol Symes had organized a panel that was featuring some work on that involved South and Southeast Asian scholars in medieval studies. And she was just on the point of launching the journal, The Medieval Globe, at the time. What I remember most about this particular panel was that I was one of about 5 people in the audience. It was very low attendance. It was really an interesting moment. But big things often have small beginnings, because I was thinking about this. When you go to a Medieval Academy of America meeting now, lots and lots of panels and papers are concerned with the global Middle Ages in one way or another. It's become much, much more common, much, much better attendance. You've seen this classic takeoff of the medieval global history. The shift to the medieval global, the global Middle Ages, just at the Medieval Academy of America, tracks an even more noteworthy transformation of history curricula in the United States over the last 2 decades. So this is a bit complicated. I don't want to get into curricular structures, but all the states, all the universities have a completely different curriculum. There's no national curriculum. So it's all preceded by fits and starts. But essentially, a few decades ago, the standard introduction was an introduction to European history, Western civilization. And now, almost universally, it's become global history month. And there's been several transformations here in Europe as well, typically much more systematic. So I've gone on this bandwagon as well, because for several years now I've been teaching an advanced undergraduate seminar on slavery in the global Middle Ages, which is related to this book project that Serena mentioned. And the book project itself, I first started getting into the question of medieval slavery from a very classic view of slavery that looked at the transformation from slavery to serfdom. And for me, the big revelation has been the turn to thinking about it as a global phenomenon and not tracking it as the transformation from serfdom to slavery. I've almost completely abandoned that old model and have developed this a much more global model. I found it really helpful to think about this particular subject. It's been much more productive to think about this global framework. So for all these reasons, I've been thinking about the global Middle Ages a lot lately. And I was also thinking about it in the fall when I came here, because one of the themes of the summer school last year was global histories, writing global histories connected and comparative. So it's a very convenient expression, the global Middle Ages. And the question is, does it have any analytical utility? Does it come with any costs? What should we be aware of when we use this term? So it's been great during this project and having a chance to talk about themes that have been central to the four fellows here, and Serena as well. Since I can't help much on the body metaphor, because it's not one I'm actually doing research on, I thought I'd use this remark, this occasion, just to talk about the writing global history side of this question. So I'm going to be grouping my remarks into roughly 4 headings. Why global? Why medieval? Why the period 500 and 1500? And you'll see I'm just making that statement from the previous question. And then finally, why now? So those are roughly the 4 things that I wanted to think about. And you're going to find there's going to be several themes that are going to be as threads operating across all the sections that I'm going to talk about. I'll be talking a lot about decentering forms of history, issues of epistemology, questions about time and periodization. So there's a number of themes or threads that follow all through these. So in each case, I'll just sort of conclude with a thesis or a proposition. And what I really want to do by that is acknowledge that I've just done a really preliminary survey of some of the literature in the field. It's really expanded enormously recently. So I'm putting these out there as an invitation to dialogue more than anything else. So one warning or confession is that I've looked at some French and German scholarship, but otherwise it's been primarily Anglophone. So apologies about that. A lot of it has to do with time constraints, trying to so that it's certainly incomplete, the survey that I've done in that regard. In point of fact, a lot of the European literature that I've seen is much more interested in global history, where the term, the medieval global history, it seems to me it's currently found less in European scholarship than it is in Anglo-centric scholarship. This is something I'd actually be interested in talking about with people here. So I'll be really interested in your thoughts and ideas about this. So let me begin. This is the question: why global? What is the global doing in global Middle Ages? And I'd like to approach this by way of this really insightful article by Natalie Zeman-Davis. In 2010, she was awarded the Holbrook Prize in Norway, and they fashioned a whole week of activities under the title "Doing Decentered History: The Global in the Local." And in the article she put together afterwards, she reported that she was asked to describe her work and its import for our period of globalization. So she's not a medievalist, but a lot of the ideas that she comes up work very, very well in this context. So what's striking about her response is that she located global history in its historiographical context. So she came of age as a scholar in the 1950s, as history was turning to the question of, in France at the time, le peuple, or as she put it, I call them the exploited and oppressed classes. That's how she launched into this in the 1950s. Later in the 1970s, with subaltern studies, this became subaltern peoples. And although she doesn't talk about more recent forms of the same dissenting move, she could have. So indigenous studies, studies of queer sexuality, animal studies, all kinds of things that displace the normative culture, the normative individual as the focus of what history is about. So what she argued in 2010 is that we are now experiencing, and here I'm quoting, the geographical wave in decentering history. She's placing them all in sequences, one type of decentering move after another. So it's just to jump outside to this, it's important to clarify this claim because there's a long, long tradition of comparative economic history. I'm sure there's people in the room who know much more about this than I do. But the literature concerning the rise of the West, rooted in figures like Max Weber, and continued in the 1970s with the man Wallerstein, under Frank, Janet Aboukhad. All the economists who work with modernization theory, there have been a lot of comparative world economic history. So it's not, that part is not new per se. But according to the historian Maxime Berg, people began to call it global history in the late 1990s in the wake of the debates about the great divergence thesis of Ken Pomerantz, the sinologist. So that's the moment, according to the literature in the field, when people began talking more and more about global history. And embedded in the new global history, according to Berg, is the idea of decentering. And in this case, the decentering meant insisting on the idea that there were multiple paths to modernity. So for those of you, again, who are familiar with the older economic history, modernization theory, there's a single path to modernity. It's the European one. And the question is, how do other nations or places find their way onto the railroad track? And what emerged, again, in the late 1990s was this multiple modernities track, and that is essential to global history. So why global, to go back to the question for this section? So Davis's answer, it's a very ordinary one, it's because the global contributes to the goal of decentering history. So it's right at this point that Davis introduces a note of concern. It's all very well, she wrote, to be committed to multiple modernities. But what about the historical agenda and categories? What if the historical epistemology itself remains Western and Eurocentric? What she's getting at here is that the history is not just a set of subjects. It's not just a question of looking at subalterns or women or different parts of the world. It's also an epistemology. Just to take an example, it relies on an understanding of time, according to which the events of the past can be assigned dates and placed on a timeline. And that generates forms of explanation following certain understandings of causality that are very, very culturally specific and situated. They're not universal. So this is the point that Davis was getting at here. So with some work, it's possible to recognize what subjective biases and overcome them by writing histories of different peoples and places. But it's much, much harder to recognize and accommodate one's epistemological bias because it's so much more embedded in the way that you think about time, about the past, about history. So I was thinking about this recently while I was rereading Dipesh Chakrabarty's book, Provincializing Europe. If you haven't seen it, he's got this lovely preface to the second edition where he engages in this autobiographical sketch. He talks about as a young man moving in Bengali intellectual circles, where one of the things that they did is they took Karl Marx, lock, stock, and barrel, all the concepts, and they applied it to the Indian subcontinent. And he says later he gradually became aware of how he just blindly accepted these categories and imposed them on Indian society and culture as if they should naturally fit. So he comes up with the idea of provincializing Europe as a way of saying, no, these concepts really don't necessarily fit here. So close to the themes of this paper, the literary scholar Kathleen Davis has expressed concerns about the Eurocentrism of concepts such as the global Middle Ages. And she points out the Middle Ages as a European historiographical category. Globalizing it, I'm quoting, can thus have the effect of fitting the entire world into Europe's self-centered narrative of historical time. I'm going to be coming back to Kathleen Davis's critique actually in the next section in more detail. So returning to now Zena Davis, she raised a second concern about the practice of global history, about what the globe is doing in this form. She asks, and I'm quoting again, whether the sharp edges of social history and gender history are being ignored in the descriptions of large-scale interactions among civilizations, trading empires, and species. Now, she doesn't actually elaborate on this, and so we're kind of left to imagine how she might have developed the critique. The way I see it, actually, is that she's been invited to the symposium. She's trying to be very nice about the theme of the symposium, but essentially she's saying, wait a minute, I have concerns about this framing. I'm not going to push it because I don't want to be rude to anyone, but that's the sense that I get from this, what she says. So in the commentaries on medieval global history, there's been a steady critique about precisely this issue. the loss of the sharp edges of social history and gender history and related things like that. So in the paper here I gave you in September, it raised a similar critique. It was very oblique. I don't think I picked up on it. So that paper, for those of you who were here, was about, it was a very archival study about peasants in this tiny valley in southern France, in Provence, and how they perceived or did not perceive global objects in their lives, in their houses. So one of the sort of latent conclusions of the paper was that these peasant families in the valley of the Ouvon were definitely participating in globalizing moves, but they were doing it in very, very particular ways, and that had to do with these linens I got particularly interested in. The theoretical inspiration here, by the way, is from Mary Douglas and Baron Isherwood, namely that different social groups have very different ways of consuming, and we shouldn't imagine that there's a single consumption model. So in Davis's language, I think this is a sharp lesson, but it's only visible if you take time to work out the details. It means you have to dial in rather than dialing out. It requires a methodology of deep reading and concentrated attention. You have to see those patterns emerging through this deep kind of archival work, which is not something that global history lends itself easily to. Davis also expressed concern about the potential loss of gender history. Long and proud tradition of gender history in the United States, in particular, where I've been tracking some of the younger scholars. There's a really interesting emerging new generation of scholars in the field. That kind of work continues to be profoundly decentering, as women in gender history has always been decentering. But it's definitely not being done on a global scale. And there have been serious questions raised about whether it even can be done on a global scale. Just by way of example, Serena Ferente, and this is a review you wrote on Volume 1 Global History, you just noted the absence of gender history. You notice it everywhere. I just out of curiosity, the piles of articles that I downloaded and was reading, I searched through afterwards looking for gender and women. Nothing. So I've arrived at thesis number 1. Not all decentering histories are global history. Natalie Zeman Davis was not making an argument against the global Middle Ages. I think she was offering a gentle reminder to the effect that the ethical contributions of history can be pursued in many ways. Microstoria generates insights that are completely invisible to the distant perspectives of global history. So for me, the more interesting question happens when we turn this around. Do global histories inherently decenter? Some medieval global histories decenter along one axis, the axis of space, but they do so at the cost of recentering history on other axes. So let me give one example, and I've been actually fretting about this a lot in recent years and collecting lots of examples. So just a couple of examples. Again, at the Medieval Academy in 2023, it's a really good place for ethnography because you can look at trends on the ground, especially if you attend regularly. There were 2 plenary addresses, both given in the spirit of medieval global history. Both were utterly fascinating. One of them featured Ethiopian kings, and the other featured high-end decorative arts. So the global Middle Ages can easily become a vehicle for valorizing the activities of wealthy and powerful elites, the kind of people we're most likely to encounter, at least in connected histories. So you can get this kind of globe-trotting medieval elites phenomenon emerging, not in all, but in many corners of medieval global history. It's especially acute in our historical circles. So just one example, Brian Keene's 2019 toward the global Middle Ages, encountering the world through illuminated manuscripts. Again, fascinating, beautiful study. But it uses these entirely unrepresentative examples as proxies for whole cultures. And for an unreconstructed social historian like me, it just doesn't work. So, thesis 1B, some global histories are only minimally decentering and they decenter only along one axis, and they leave other axes untouched. Now, not everyone is interested in decentering history, of course, so the kinds of ethical lessons that Natalie Davis favored, those are not universal. We do history for lots of reasons. I'm not trying to say we all need to decenter history, but if you're going to do it, then the thesis 1A and 1B suggest two things. First of all, they suggest the need to recognize the value of local history as an object for decentering history. And I think, I was thinking a lot about this afternoon as I was kind of tweaking. It's an approach that complements global history because it decenters in a different way. And you just can't get the full spectrum unless you preserve the local alongside the global. Second, the two theses suggest hard questions about the recentering move of at least some forms of global history. In other words, they're bringing us back to stories of rich and powerful elites that we always need to be careful about, because it's an easy draw to fall back into that kind of world. So, section 2, why medieval? And literally, medieval with the quotes here in the Middle Ages. Almost without exception, historians who promoted the idea of the global Middle Ages have expressed doubts about the wisdom of exporting a term borrowed from European historical epistemology to other parts of the globe. It's just universal. So to take an example, Catherine Holmes and Naomi Stanton have been two of the most prominent proponents of global Middle Ages. They put together a series of really formative workshops and brought together a really, really fascinating network of people. And at the workshop on periodization, they report that numerous questions were raised by what they called the historiographical baggage associated with the terms of medieval and Middle Ages. So the most sustained critique of the word itself, in its two forms, has come from this literary scholar, Kathleen Davis. So I'll just summarize briefly her major work, Periodization and Sovereignty. It's a book where she argues that the Middle Ages, at least as we know them now, were invented as part of the nation-building exercise in the later 19th century. And it served two purposes with respect to sovereignty. One was to provide an origin of national roots, and the other one was to describe the superiority of European civilization. So it was in the context of nation-building exercises that the Middle Ages became superstitious, religious, feudal, backward, irrational, and static. These were attributes associated with colonial subjects. This is the key part of Kathleen Davis's argument. At the time, late 19th century, early 20th century, there was a massive effort underway to place all world historical societies on a single chronology of civilization. And that has to do with the non-Darwinian revolution, social theory, which takes us a long way away from this paper. But basically, all cultures were being pinned onto a timeline of progress from primitive to advanced. So the pejorative attributes were projected onto the European past in order to demonstrate how far Europe had advanced, but more importantly, how far the rest of the world had gone. So this is the essence of how Davis is arguing. So what emerges from this claim is that the word medieval itself has become so inextricably associated with its colonial meaning that it's unusable as a term of analysis. So Davis develops a related problem with the term the global Middle Ages. And here, her claim is that the term unwittingly serves to legitimate global capitalism. And by the way, she takes it for granted that historians are not in favor of global capitalism. I'm just going to be neutral about that. I'm just reporting her argument. So that the term unwittingly serves to legitimate global capitalism. I remember reading this and thinking, wow, how is she going to get through here? It's a very subtle argument, so I'm just going to lay it out here. And if we want to follow along with the Q&A, that would be great. The argument runs like this. Global capitalism necessarily seeks to undermine state sovereignty. It's not in favor of market controls. It's not in favor of social security, it's not in favor of national currencies, nationalized industries. There's lots of elements of national apparatus that global capitalism is ceaselessly trying to undermine or work around or get by. So how does global capitalism go about authenticating itself, making it a legitimate player on a stage that's currently still, well, it's obviously contested, but currently still occupied by nation states? So her suggestion here is global capitalism delights in the idea of promoting an alternative history of the Middle Ages, one that doesn't feature the roots of nations, but instead the roots of a global order stretching across myriad trade routes, featuring intercultural experiences. The historians, I've found this argument actually in various forms. Jeremy Engelman makes a very similar argument. The historians Thomas Erhel and Klaus Oshema have actually raised similar concerns. So this is even in an Austrian-German context, we're finding similar things. They argue, and I'm quoting, the global Middle Ages should not become another project co-opted by elites educated at Western universities to put a friendly face on globalization and celebrate materially well-off cosmopolitans with a new lifestyle. So this is one of those arguments I want to track more and follow more. I'm interested in seeing whether people buy it, but it did cause me to think a lot more about the complexities of the global Middle Ages as a term. For the Chinese historian Michael Puett, the problems lie less with the medieval than with the idea of the modern. And he's particularly concerned about the contrast between a dynamic modernity and a static pre-modernity. Again, I'm sure there's people here much more versed in Chinese historiography than I am, but this is a constant problem faced by Chinese historiography. How come we have been accused of just spinning around and never getting anywhere? So Chinese historians are constantly aware of the need they feel the pressure to develop claims about how they entered into modernity in some way or another. So, as Pue's looking at this landscape, he says, just the modern has been really damaging for the ways in which we conduct Chinese history. It's not helping how we do things. So the fundamental problem, this is the point that Puet makes, is that when you use the word medieval, you're using it because it's the contrast to modernity, and therefore you inadvertently evoke the modern even when you use the medieval. And therefore the medieval becomes problematic because it just reinvents the modern kind of ceaselessly. So thesis 2, unsurprisingly, is that medieval has little utility as a term of analysis. Here, the question is whether it's possible to remove medieval from its intellectual genealogy and refashion it as a neutral label. And again, in the literature, this is a move that people are coming back to constantly. Holmes and Standen, for example, say, essentially, yeah, we recognize the problems, but who cares? It's just a word. We can use it mindful of how, where it came from, but just say, we're not going to participate in that. We're just going to use it because we want to think about this period. It's just a useful label. And again, you see that popping up across a lot of literature. This is something I'd be really interested in following up with you in the Q&A just to see what you think about this. Lately, the most common solution to this problem has been to replace medieval with the word pre-modern. And references to pre-modern have actually soared in recent discourse, especially in Anglophone discourse. I was recently discussing this in France with French scholars. They say it's still not really used much in France. I simply don't know enough about Italy and Germany but I'd be really curious to hear. But it's certainly really common in Anglophone context. But if we follow Puet, and here Puet is just representing a fairly broad current of thought about the perils of talking about modernity. Using the word pre-modern is no solution at all, because once again it insists even more strongly on modernity as a useful category of analysis. It's sort of a gravitational center where the pre is just that little moon that's circling around it. So, section 3, why 500 to 1500? So, in talking about the medieval, I was talking in the previous section, I was talking largely about questions of nomenclature. So I'd like to continue pursuing this question, why medieval, but from a different point of view. What is to be gained or lost by an approach that considers phenomena that took place within a chronological framework conventionally associated with the Middle Ages, namely 500 to 1500? Global history, as it emerged in the late 1990s, was concerned almost exclusively with flows or exchanges, the connected history of the title, in the title of the summer school last year. So one thinks of figures like Sanchez and Romano, connected history, the idea that what you're looking at are things that actually move somehow. So conveniently, one way to think about this is the degree to which a farmer or laborer in the valley of the Ouvone in southern France was affected by events taking place in China. If that individual is not affected, you're not getting in a very global world, and if that individual is affected, you are. So it's a kind of an interesting measure of the degree or the presence of the global. The strongest argument in favor of the idea of concentrating historical attention on the period 500 to 1500 arises from the fact that it is possible to identify flows or exchanges that took place in the period. Now, I'm not going to list them all, but movements of people, movements of ideas, trade goods. The very first issue of the Medieval Globe was devoted to pandemics, so movements of diseases, and you could come up with lots and lots of other examples, so I'm not going to go into discussing all that. By far the most important figure here is the American sociologist Janet Abou-Lughod, and in particular her 1989 book, Before European Hegemony. So in this book, Abou-Lughod argued that the 13th century saw the apotheosis of a distinctive world system. So a world system, but one that was not modern in its shape or its forms. And in particular, it was not hegemonic. It had plural centers, and it had lots of qualities that were not associated with the core periphery model that, according to Wallerstein and others, developed after the 16th century. In her model, that particular world was shattered by the Black Death and the collapse of the Mongol world system, which caused a decline of the East and therefore created the preconditions for the rise of the West. That's Abou-Lughod's argument. It's cited absolutely ubiquitously in the global Middle Ages scholarship. And what's really striking is her ideas are present even when she's not mentioned. So it's so much baked into the idea that people don't even have to refer to her anymore. So medievalists have used Abou-Lughod's framework to do two things. First, the framework suggests that the period in question has a reality that is independent of its use in European historiography. Second, the framework suggests that it's a world that was profoundly and proudly non-modern, plural, diverse, and non-hegemonic. So it has lots of sort of moral qualities that people are in favor of. So I'm going to do something, I'm just going to completely bracket the question about whether Abou-Lughod is right or not, because that's going to take us a long way away. I will say that there's serious questions about the model. But let's just leave that aside. The problem with this position, for me at least, lies in the manner in which it extracts the Afro-Eurasian world from its own historical context. It creates this band 500 to 1500 and imagines that it's possible to consider things happening in that time period without reference to the historical context. So it assumes that the distinctive properties of this world derived from the flows that connected the parts rather than from any historical antecedents. Simultaneously, it tacitly assumes that the flows themselves were novel or unprecedented. In other words, the period is like a building that's mounted on foundations that consist of a static prehistorical space, the world as it was, stretching back thousands of years or more, that isn't interesting, because all the action is happening right here. Now, Serena already mentioned my interest in the deep past, so here you're getting the deep historical perspective. We have known for a long time that human systems since the Stone Age have been characterized by the long-distance flows of people's goods and diseases. And again, I'm not going to give you a long list of this, but it's been a major feature of this scholarship for a long time. Let me just provide one instance of a work that has addressed the implications of this for these debates. And this is Nicole Boivin's and Michael Frekendi's 2018 book, Globalization and Prehistory, Contact Exchange and the People Without History. So one of the goals of this volume is to demonstrate the existence of globalizing processes in earlier historical periods. And the editors and the contributors insist on the fact that these processes were not led by state-level actors. Instead, the actors were the peoples without history of the title. Peasants, steppe nomads, caravan leaders, sailors, forest dwellers. There's actually a whole panoply of really interesting actors that come out of the work. What are the globalizing processes that they talk about? Here we kind of run up with this serious problem that in any time space that doesn't seem to cross the globe. How can you talk about globalizing processes? How can you talk about them when they seem to be small in some way or another? One of the solutions, I'm just going to give you one solution among many in the archaeological literature, is by an archaeologist called Justin Jennings. This is Globalizations and the Ancient World. It came out in 2011. So according to Jennings, what matters is not the geographical reach of a given phenomenon. It doesn't have to travel from Africa to California. But the presence or absence of some of the key diagnostic processes associated with globalization. So he identifies 8 of these. I'm going to spare you all 8. I'm just going to give you a couple of examples. One of them is, he defines as time-space compression. The ability of one place to rapidly affect several other, that ability increases, resulting in a world that seems to be becoming smaller. So it's not how far an influence spreads, but whether the ability for two regions that are not closely associated to affect one another becomes more rapid. It doesn't have to happen in hours or days. It just has to happen more rapidly from how it was happening before. So let's imagine a scenario might take thousands of years for a certain type of bone chipping technology across the Siberia. If a ceramic technology crosses the same space within 50 years or 100 years, then you've got what he calls time-space compression. And that's a feature of a globalizing process. Another really interesting one he calls re-embedding the local. You can imagine the presence of globalizing processes when you find cultures that are promoting local practices and traditions in the face of growing outside influence and the invention of new traditions. So if you see a kind of an exaggeration of traditional forms, again, the kind of thing you can see archaeologically. So again, you don't have to, in this model, you don't have to cover huge geographical spaces. All you have to show is the presence of some of these 8 qualities. So this volume is an example of a growing body of archaeological literature that's concerned with globalizing processes in earlier historical periods. Another famous example is Mark Jones's and colleagues' evocation of food globalization starting 4,000 years ago. And again, this literature is just pockmarked with, the scholarship is pockmarked with subjects. So the scholarship that has been promoting global history of the period 500 to 1500 is almost entirely indifferent to the deeper historical context of the societies in question. The focus is intensely fixated on modernity. So when I picture this in my mind, I see proponents standing with their back to the deeper past, fixated on modernity, and wanting to get more of a piece of the pie. So the invitation here is to turn around and think about your own historical context more profoundly. There's something for me intensely ironic about a stance that is relentlessly modern-focused in its outlook. And the irony of this stance is conveyed by a well-known scholar who writes about promoting multiple kinds of worlding in deep time, only to announce in the next sentence that the time parameters will be 500 to 1500. So it's the conjunction of deep time with 500 to 1500. So thesis 3 then is that the conceptual apparatus of the global Middle Ages remains trapped in shallow time, and it silences all forms of decentered history that operate or could operate along the axis of deep time. So for the short fourth and final section, I'd like to ask why not. In this literature, one of the things that you've seen again and again is that the global Middle Ages, or global history in general, makes history less Eurocentric. And that's one of the major justifications for doing it. Nora Berend, in her comment on global medieval history that came out last year, had a particularly pointed comment about that because global history itself is coming under more sustained critique by people like Galen and others. So she comments on the fact that medievalists are arriving to the party just as other people are beginning to leave. What's really interesting about this is that the global paradigm isn't the only solution to Eurocentrism, because you could just pour more resources into area history. You don't have to do it by doing global history. So it's interesting that the global framework is useful because it gives scholars of Europe a chance to remain relevant. Another factor, a really obvious one, again this is scattered all across the literature, is the rise of ultra-right-wing nationalism and the dissemination of ideas of white supremacy, creatively rooted in the European past. This was particularly visible in the response to Patrick Boucheron et al.'s proposal for Histoire mondiale de la France, because a lot of the response was this nativist circling wagons around the glories of French civilization and not wanting to have anything to do with anything else. In the United States, possibly here you'll know more about this than I do, that medieval global history has become a proxy for concerns about hiring people of color. So it's been very closely associated with questions of hiring in our field. Giorgio made a really interesting point as we were chatting the other day, that as the modern historical curriculum shifts to global history, medievalists have to jump on the bandwagon to stay relevant. So I'll let you fill us in on this, Giorgio, later. So there's lots of really interesting reasons for why it's happening right now. And as I was thinking about these, I guess I would like to underscore that these are sensible and even noble goals. And so the question is only one of whether the framework itself is analytically coherent. My concern is that if the framework isn't analytically coherent, then what we will be doing will not be intellectually sustainable. And we need to establish a secure analytical framework in order to make the scholarship durable. So thesis 4 then is that the global Middle Ages is not a term of analysis. It's a term of art. Its primary function is to serve as a moral statement. So as it happens, I agree with many or even most of the moral and pedagogical objectives of medieval global history. I'm committed to the idea that art histories can and should be centered. In my classroom, I really like to center students. It makes me feel good. I can get them out, shake them up a little bit. I believe in area studies. I like looking at things all around the world. And area studies are valuable because they reward close reading and they reward deep knowledge of language and culture. And these things really matter. We need to preserve them. I believe that all our histories should regularly cross the scale of observation from the close to the distant. And I also believe that our historical frameworks should be capable of considering long stretches of time. All this is history worth doing, and it's worth doing right. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much, Dan. I have a lot of things that came to mind while you were talking, but I think I should ask the audience if anyone wants to break the ice first. Giorgio.
I just want to pick up on something you just said right at the very end, this kind of you believe in evidence studies, and a little bit your tone of saying that was kind of almost a lament, as if it could be in decline. I was wondering, perhaps, if I got your tone right there, is it really time to worry about perhaps area studies and the way it's funded has a certain usefulness that global history doesn't in an American context? And here I'm thinking about the role, the embedded role area studies has had in American grant strategy, which is related to funding, curricula, military colleges. I just wanted to ask you a little bit about, is there a kind of takeoff of this kind of thinking of global history in, you know, the kind of key centres of American strategy, thinking how history is taught there? Is it something that's kind of emerging and spreading? And is there, I'm kind of, just to say a little bit more about, do you see a kind of institutional threat to area studies in the American context now because of this turn towards thinking globally?
Yep. It's something I've thought a lot about, Giorgio. And I was going to feature this question in this paper and realized I need to talk to a lot more people in area studies to be confident of saying anything about it. So I'm going to give you some ill-formed opinions, which personally I'm just going to be following up on. So the medieval global history for area studies is both a tremendous opportunity and a possible danger or a threat. And I'm only talking about the U.S. University system now, because it's the only one that I know. But it has to do with the funds and the support that necessarily subtend all area studies programs. Because deans are trying to claw back all the money that they can now. And closing programs is a high priority for lots of people. It's a tremendous opportunity because there's ways for area studies programs to demonstrate their relevance by participating in these interdisciplinary or interfield programs. So Geraldine Yang has this lovely little article talking about teaching with a number of colleagues from South Asia, Africa, Indian Ocean, East Asia. And it sounds like it was an amazing curriculum, and the things that they've done are really remarkable. So that's the opportunity side. The problematic side has to do with if there's a particular move to if there's a suggestion that everything should be folded into a single framework, a global Middle Ages framework, then it provides the justification for saying, we don't need to have an area studies program that focuses on just the area. What we want to take, we want to dismantle these area studies programs and integrate people laterally into faculty in their own time band. So we can just move all the people who happen to work Han China, just in the history department, for example. Because they don't need to be in an area studies program. So my hesitation there is that I haven't actually seen any evidence that that's happening. So it's one of those things that the reason I didn't want to talk about it explicitly in the paper was I'd really like to talk to more area studies people to see whether it's a trend.
Yagi.
I was interested in what you said about time, and I'm wondering, like, especially in the Buddhist world, time is the perception of time is mainly as cyclical. But how do you integrate something like that in the writing of history? Like particular conceptions of time that are so different from what you do when you write history.
I can't do it. I've tried. so I don't have much experience with the Buddhist sense of time, but I have done, for a period of time, I won't explain why I was collaborating with a group of scholars, actually for about a decade, in Australian Aborigine studies. So I got quite familiar with a lot of the trends in Aboriginal studies, Indigenous scholarship in general, but mostly in Australia, some in America as well. And one of the things I found most fascinating was how the perception of time, especially from Indigenous scholars, was completely different from the Western concept of time. So one person explained it to me in this way, and this is just, it's not a universal climate, it just happens to do with the people they haven't worked with. He said, if you try to understand this particular group's understanding of time, imagine that time isn't the surface of an ocean stretching out from a beach, and the tsunami has come and brought all the things, all the flotsam and jetsam of the past that in our world stretches out to the horizon, has brought all of them around the face of the tsunami, so it's all present right there on the beach, like in a vertical wall. So one way of thinking about that is that the past isn't past. It's constantly present, rather than being past. And it was a really vivid moment because I could get the metaphor, I could get the idea that the past isn't past for these people in the way the past is past for me. And it explained a lot. But what I can do then, I've tried writing it this way, but I find it very hard to unpick my own timeline of history and try to imagine a history that's done where the past isn't past in this way. It works, I've found it works in some cases when I'm dealing with actual articles of material culture. That's the one case where I found it possible. So I was evoking this issue of time understandings more for the point of, I don't think I can escape my epistemology in this sense. In this case, I just want to be very, very aware of it. I don't know if that helps.
Can you distinguish any patterns in the choice of problematics by the global medieval historians? So what would be the privileged topics by which medieval global historians would start and then probably go to other topics? And the second question is, your opinion, how would digital scholarship change the area of medieval global history, apart from what we can say, like the scale of analysis? So it's evident that digital scholarship enables a pampered vision of things, both from chronological and territorial point of view, but what else can it change?
So for your first question for the topics, is this just a question of what kinds of topics does one find in
Yeah, what are the topics that are more pertinent for global medieval historians in Europe and in America?
It's exceedingly variable, so it really depends upon whether one is taking a connected approach or one is taking a comparative approach. So for connected scholarship, just this manuscript book that I mentioned is an example. In other words, there's certain motifs that circulate among different types of manuscripts, and the idea is to look at those motifs and how they move around in manuscript world. Everything that's economic falls into this connected. So there's particular types of trade goods. I was just reading an article about ivory production in Central Africa, and how this particular article was making the point that changes in climate were generating more ivory production, or more ivory offtake, I should say, which led to an explosion of ivory carving in Europe because of increased imports. So it's putting Europe and Africa together in kind of this same framework and explaining a European phenomenon by describing African antecedents in, again, ivory trade. So again, a really interesting example. So the only question has to do with this point that I made about how it tends to skew towards elite and well-to-do people, political elites and well-to-do people. So the comparative histories are very different because you're completely liberated. You don't have to actually find a flow. You just have to find some kind of similarity. So the project you're doing fits very, very clearly to this model. You can look at the metaphor of the body politic without making or insisting or even wanting to claim that there's necessarily a connection. I mean, the maybe, but that's not necessarily part of it. So there's a lot of other comparative histories that come up. So like John Arnold, for example, is recently talking about a comparative history of peasantries as a way of looking at non-math subjects. I could say more about comparative and connected histories later if we want to go more into detail. It's a little vexed about when you use the one and when you use the other. Digital scholarship, there's two sides to that question. One is anyone doing it? I didn't find a single instance of reference to digital scholarship. Have you seen any?
In global.
Yeah.
Hilda probably starts in her project. So she
Hilda
starts from
is-
China, but
Yeah.
Ferente is more.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But it was a global though. I think most of the manuscripts she took in her database were Chinese.
So it would become global if you can take that and compare it to a similar
If you
digital.
create databases and
Yeah.
research questions that can work.
Well, there are quite a lot of databases now and repositories, so just nobody does it.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the only thing I can think that even that I've seen that only hardly participates in the digital with a very lowercase d is there's a lot of interest in CGI reconstructions of, say, ancient Thai temples and getting students to come into those. So that's the one thing I've seen. So again, it's not the data side of digital. It's the representation side of digital. That's the one thing I've seen much more.
Just to specify, the history of ideas, if you can, like the history of metaphors, it would go to comparative part, to connected part of the global.
Could go both. Yeah.
And also it's not done very much. I think what this project is doing is not something that is done very much. Intellectual history is not done very much. It's the history of material culture, the history of religion, which is of course very close to intellectual history in some respects. But I don't know of any project that does global intellectual history before modernity. I think it's very difficult to do it even for the modernity side, but it's done much more, of course.
Any other?
Isabella?
Thank you very much. That was really, really interesting and made me think a lot of things, but two small details, peripheral details in your talk. One relates to a book written recently by Chris Wickham, The Wolf and Donkey, which made me think that this idea of getting local gets closer to some sort of explanation than getting global. It's a book that obviously went down quite badly initially, you can imagine, because it's against the grand narrative of the international trade as a mode of for modernity. And something else is when you're talking about this decentralizing history, I'm coordinating a collective book on peacemaking and treaties from the 14th to the 17th century for also the University Press. And most of the treaties and the context are European or Mediterranean at its most. Mamluks with Ottomans, this kind of stuff. One of the criticisms we got from the referees was that it was not global. We didn't put any Chinese example or African example or something like that. And my response, that was my responsibility actually, we are three in the editing panel, but I was the one who responded on this, was that, we need as European scholars first to dismantle the same mechanisms that have been essential in 19th century grand narrative of this sort of things. We don't know enough about peace treaties like Westphalia and the image that was used about them afterwards. We don't know how the peacemaking process between the Middle Ages and the early modern. And that's something we can do, I think, in a proper way without incurring in too many ideological or theoretical traps, and that can help a bit to go towards a history that could be global without being global in an easy sense. So just putting together cases, different cases, and making a catalog as we did before. That's the same thing in gender studies and women's studies. You don't go very far if you put a catalog of exceptional experiences or case studies. You do go farther if you get into a single. That I find very, very. I agree with you very much with your. Provence more about the individual story that can tell us much more. So thank you for comfort in a way. I don't know if you agree, but this can be a different kind of approach of the same kind of methodological bigger problems that we face to get out of this heavy Western European arguments.
I'm embarrassed to say that I have not yet read Bacon's book. I've talked to a lot of people about it, and it's definitely on my agenda.
We presented it in Bologna, the PhD program seminar, so we had some look at it, and it's a challenging thesis, of course. It's also
I actually told Chris, so I'm not speaking out of
I would have said that it was wrong, but then I read it and I listened to it, and it quite convinced me.
Okay.
I'm not sorry, I'm not high in the latest. I'm a political late in the latest.
Same, as you know.
Exactly.
But from Isabel, from what I understand from your question, that part of it has to do with the fact that it's a way of saying that there's a value to taking a very local approach and illuminating things. Clearly I agree with that. I sometimes think about this, to think about metaphor for a moment, that this global approaches are wonderful. I have actually no objection to it. I do them all the time. So the concern is one of universalizing. If you start to universalize, it becomes a measure. It becomes, you can't publish this book unless you do it. Here the metaphor is that it's a bit like in physics, suggesting that of all the forces out there, gravity is the most important because it's the biggest, as opposed to the strong nuclear force, because it's so small and therefore not interesting. They do completely different things at different scales. We just have to understand that it's all part of the way that the universe works. So that would be my response to that. On the peacemaking procedures, there's an issue here which I don't know quite how to raise properly, but well, let me put it this way. This is a vocabulary issue. A lot of people in the United States, and again, I just can't speak for colleagues in Europe, so you'd have to tell me. We'll often just use the idea of, we'll talk about something happening in the Middle Ages. I've found myself, for the last 5, 10, 15 years, correcting them, or correcting my own language to say the European Middle Ages. Just as, the idea is to say, what I'm saying about something, if the expression is something happened in the Middle Ages, I say, what do you mean the European Middle Ages? It's a try to develop a certain armor against claiming the universality of the European experience. So I avoid universalizing the European experience by adding Europe to it. All I know about peacemaking procedures are the ones that are happening in Europe, and they're interesting for those reasons. And I'm not making claims about the universalizing. So the suggestion of, it seems to me as a complete outsider that when someone is suggesting that you need to have peace treaties from all around the world, it's for you, so that you can, it prevents you from claiming that too much universalizing value for your conclusions. Which in my case, I wasn't claiming that from the start. I think of the things that I study as being case studies that are very particular to the local historical context. I try not to universalize it. So I completely agree that the problem with European history was that it wasn't universalized. In the United States, no one universalizes European history anymore. It's just not done, apart from these legacies of speech, like not using European Middle Ages, but Europe got provincialized a long time ago. It's kind of a late child, right? And I don't know whether that's the case here, but it's not a particular problem in the United States, and that's because we're not Europe. So Europe is a different world. So it's easy for us to say, there's Europe, there's China, there's South Asia, there's Africa. They're all interesting world historical regions, and they're all worth studying.
I have a couple of points because I felt you were raising a lot. I thought you were presenting us almost a social history of the formation of the field, if the global Middle Ages is a field or sort of this new movement. You did not say much in terms of its heuristic value. So is it actually bringing us knowledge that we didn't have before? Aside from doing all these things in departments, in careers, in the public discourse, etc. And I think we are a bit I find that some colleagues are actually quicker to criticize the movement without actually having read about cultures that are not the ones they're already familiar with, and make the effort, because let's be honest, it is an effort to go beyond their comfort zone, which is a comfort zone that is hardly earned for many, but it requires a lot of technical training, a lot of learning of different languages, a challenge that some of our colleagues working on a modern period don't have. They can do global history sometimes with managing just one language. They plant themselves in Lisbon or in London Kew Gardens, and they write a global history with archives that are in fact colonial. So it seems to me that medievalists actually have a much less morally and ethically compromised position when they do global history than our colleagues who do it for the early modern and modern period, because if there is something that everyone can agree with is that for the period that more or less we may want to call medieval or sort of whatever section of the chronology we examine, there's no European hegemony. And this translates into the absence of an archival hegemony. So you need to deal with, if you want to do research on the primary sources, with multiplication of effort. And I wonder how much of this return to the national or to the local is a fetishism of another kind. I mean, in Italy, when I was growing up as a young student of history as an undergraduate, it was not uncommon to go to a conference devoted to communal history, where people would adamantly say, oh, I'm presenting the case of Asti. What I'm saying applies only to Asti. It cannot be extended to Turin, and it certainly cannot be extended to Milan. Yeah? So this is the kind of fetishism of the local that is not at all unknown in medieval studies, and that is its own form of privilege. It's its own form of privilege because it refuses to subject the particular case to a vision that is wider, that is necessarily alienating. Because when you're understanding something with your own internal kind of tools, you recognize it. It's your own comfortable place. But when someone else comes from the outside and says, look, what's happening here is actually very similar to what's happening there, you feel like your uniqueness is being put into question a little bit. And I think there is a little bit of that is going on, actually, that part of this reflection that has emerged against the global Middle Ages, and I mean, I have to observe that most of the historians you cited that actually carry European or Western names comes from people who have practiced histories, even the sinologists, in their own kind of cell, and according to tools that they've learned as students and that are comfortable because they are well tested by time. It is indeed a very disconcerting and a little bit humbling experience to have to expand, to put yourself in a topic that that presents you with a different way of seeing things, different chronologies, different vocabularies, different categories of historical interpretation. And I wonder whether this sort of dualism that Kathleen Davis was presenting when she talks about the Middle Ages, it's either the global capitalism or the national Middle Ages, is not a straitjacket. Is this really the only binary we can deal with? We are either global capitalists or we are nationalists, because this is politically what is happening at the moment, actually. So it's sort of kind of disconcerting to accept that this is indeed the only alternative we have, in my opinion. So I was wondering if you see a little bit of this ingenuous element to this, debate about the global Middle Ages, and I completely see what the kind of trends you have identified, the influence of an earlier world history tradition, Abdul-God, Wallerstein, and sort of the great world histories of the early 20th century. This is very strong at Oxford, or was very strong at Oxford when they created the moniker Global Middle Ages, the kind of divergent studies of Pomeranz, etc. So all of this is clearly present, but in a sense, I'm not sure all of these affects medievalists in the same way in which it affects early modernists and modernists. I think that the challenge for medievalists, or people trained to study these periods, the chronologies of which vary depending on the area that you're studying, actually, is not a different kind of challenge, and a very difficult one that puts people in a difficult position. This said, of course, we all believe that sound scholarship is scholarship that is done within the limits of your competence. So I agree with that, of course. Yeah. So this was the first point. The second point was about the label medieval. So the first time I read an essay by Timothy Insel on Timbuktu in the later medieval period, the history of a city oasis in West Africa, in Mali today, He was citing the work of a Brazilian Ghanaian medievalist, Moraes Farias, who already in 1976 said that he had no problem whatsoever with using the category medieval for sub-Saharan history because, in his opinion, this was a dead metaphor. He said, yes, I know everything about what medieval means. It's anti-modern, it's European, it's the Vikings, etc., etc. But it's been used so much, it's very much what Catherine Holmes later repeated, it's been used so much, it has become such an average and kind of mainstream kind of word that it has lost a lot of its power. And I have no problem applying this category to Mali. We've heard from Hilde de Weert and from other sinologists that in Chinese history, it's not a big deal to use the category medieval, provided we all know that they're not importing the chronologies, the modernity issues of the European Middle Ages. If we need a pragmatic label that brings us together at conferences and that allows us to establish a dialogue, they have no problem with using medieval. So isn't, again, this constant return on the label Middle Ages another way of reasserting sort of the primacy of the European category, going back to its genealogy to say, this is actually what it means, and even if you're using it differently, you don't know that you're buying the whole thing with it. When other scholars who not only come from different countries but study different areas are telling you we're fine, I think we can be fine as well, right? Sort of, it's not as problematic, perhaps, as it would be if this was completely an unreflected, kind of a subconscious baggage that the label still brings and that people are not entirely aware of. We were discussing, I think in September, with Yagi and Lucia Dolce, that the use of the label Middle Ages, so medieval in Japanese history, is very old. You can say, oh, it's because Japanese historiography has always been westernized early on. You can say what you want, but it is a label that is now quite sort of neutral, right? And that it means something. It means something in the context of Japanese history, with no reference to European history. This is a little bit what I'm seeing, sort of from my observation point in Amsterdam, and also having come from the UK, that both the advent of the global Middle Ages, but also the very quick criticism of the global Middle Ages that followed within 10 years, fundamentally, were both justified by, social, political, ideological positions that have been clearly described for the global Middle Ages and perhaps less clearly described for the critics of the global Middle Ages. And I was wondering what you think about this. So in a way, isn't there something behind this criticism of the global label that has to do less with objections that are epistemological and that are ideological, and more with, as I said, a certain fetishism of the local, a certain comfort that that people feel in reproducing modes of study, units of study, tools that they have been familiar with for now 200 years of medieval scholarship. The kind of baggage that a medieval scholar needs to have to become a proper medievalist hasn't changed much if you look at Europe since the 19th century. You learn Latin, you learn paleography, you learn the diplomatics, etc., etc. So this hasn't changed for so long, and it's clear that people feel a certain comfort with it, right? So,
thank you. There's partly a difference here between the way the terrain looks from the United States and the way it looks from Europe. We have so many fewer medievalists in the country that we can never afford the fetishism of the world. It just doesn't happen. That happens in U.S. history, and it happens in exactly the same ways that you described, the way it happens here. But it doesn't happen in the U.S. There's very, very few people who do the kind of work that I do in the United States. So when we get together and talk about some other things, we naturally extrapolate from cases and we build generalities. So So the issue then, it takes on a different valence depending on which side they want to grasp the restaurant. So I'm just frankly giving you not a universal experience, but a subjective United States experience. So I felt a great deal about the fact that everything looks very different in Europe. You know, I mentioned to you by email beforehand that I would never talk about this in France because most of my French colleagues are so, you know, opposed to it. I wouldn't want to give them ammunition. Because that's where I've experienced the fetishism of the local very, very intensely. It doesn't work very well for me. On this issue about whether we need to just allow medieval to serve as an empty neutral term, I'm just going to ventriloquize what I think Kathleen Davis would say here. I think she'd say, think back 30 years. This would be in the US, this is more recent in Europe. When a push developed in academia and beyond that to use gender neutral pronouns. At the time, everyone was saying, no, it doesn't make any difference to me if I use he or him talking about the world. I don't mean that. I just mean people. It's completely neutral. I never believed it then, and I made it, when I learned about this, I made an effort to shift to gender-appropriate pronouns whenever I could, because lying behind that are certain structures of thinking, such as the medieval modern one, that even if you say I'm neutral about it, you're constantly re-invoking and constantly present. So I'm actually less concerned about medieval than I am concerned about pre-modern. And I've written a lot more about pre-modern, I've written more about the pre. I'm more comfortable talking about the problems with the pre and how it generates the use of it as a form of Stockholm syndrome. It generates the very object that it pretends to avoid. And I'm also concerned about the way that pre-modernity has just become this very flat historical space that occupies the Rockian ceaselessly. This is societies that ceaselessly turn and turn again and never get anywhere. So the point about evacuating the pre from vocabulary allows you to say, well, before all the amazing things that were happening in 500, 1500, let's look at what Martin Jones and his colleagues talk about, food colonialization, completely invisible to every single person who's still operating under, I'm just going to do medieval because I've always done it that way. It constrains perspective to a time space. For the kinds of questions I'm interested in, are just not interesting. It just actually shuts off dialogue because I'm interested in these kinds of dialogues as well as these kinds of dialogues.
Yeah, that's clear.
So I don't know how you could have, can you evacuate medieval pre in the same way that we successfully evacuated gender pronouns? I don't know, but that's the invitation. I think that's one way that Kathleen Davis might put that.
Enzo.
For us, for the student that study the modern age, we have not a big problem to study global history in general. We have no reaction against global history because it's clear that, for example, I studied the 18th century. We had the universal history published in the same page. It's not a big problem. It's not clear for me the reaction in Europe against, in the media, medieval global history, in the European place. Because, for example, for the people that study in the modern history, we have a disposition, the reflection, elaborate in the 18th century above all, about the different context, the history of Japan, the history of China, a big debate about the history of China in the 18th century, very, very important and very rich debate. I think that the problem is that for us, we have not the difficulty to put in the field the question of the problem history, not the connection, the problem. For example, here in Turin, in this period, we studied the problem of boundary, slavery, the slavery in the ancient age and in the modern age, the difference. This problem, I think that the global history could be very important to do, connected by the problem of the historical problem, not the prosopoph. In general, we have the history of Japanese, the history of China. But if we go to reflect about the problem of, about the hypothesis connected by the big problem, I think that is better for us. It's better because the global history become more rich, give a lot of indication, and it's not a prosopography historiography. I think that this is a big reaction against the global history in general.
Yeah, one of the things one of the very fine lines I was trying to follow in this paper, part of the reason I was expressing the concern, in particular in the first section about the focus on the political elites and financial elites, is because the kind of approaches and insights that you can get from global history done in the post-medieval people allow you to see a much broader spectrum of the world than you typically see if you're doing connected histories in the Middle Ages. So in that case, my only goal there was to say we have to be aware about how the thinness of people and the movement of people and things, it's much, much smaller than it is in the modern period. It directly affects a much smaller spectrum of the population. We have to be constantly aware of that. So it doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. It's just it means we have to be constantly aware of it. And that's why I made the comment about, I'm the boring social historian who says ordinary people are actors in history too. So ordinary people can be actors in modern global history easily. It happens all the time. But it's really hard to fit them in as actors in medieval global histories. So that was my only concern about that as a social historic perspective. So the answer to that, this is a whole section of the paper I cut out, the answer to that has come from, we can introduce them via comparative history. So you don't necessarily have to actually have movements of people, you can do it comparatively. But the real issue here, which I won't get into, but I'll just put out the basic idea that I was going to present, is that the problem of comparative history is that comparison is a timeless phenomenon. It is not attached to date stamps. You can compare things in any time and place, and you don't have to compare them in this case in the date stamps associated with the Middle Ages. So the more that the global Middle Ages scholarship says, we don't have to do just connected, we can do comparative, the more it undermines focusing just on this late slice, 500 to 1500. So my concern here is not about the perspective, it's just about what do you get from the focus on the Middle Ages, because I think that's just the legacy or hangover from an older historiographical model that we don't need anymore.
In a way, there could be an underlying connectedness. For example, environmental history. If we do believe that there is a rise in temperatures around the year 1000 and that this affects regions around Afro-Eurasia, perhaps even North America, and we are doing the comparative history of peasantries, this is a connected history by the environmental change, but not by much else. Say, if you pick a peasantry in, say, the Ganges and peasantry in northern France, of course, but still, there is a bit of a dialogue between connectedness and comparison, that in a way, by comparing, you may discover connectedness. connections if you don't compare and don't discover them.
Absolutely.
And vice versa, by drawing a connection, then you can discover comparative elements that may actually bring up differences rather than similarities, because that's one of the jobs of comparative history. Yeah, it's something we didn't quite explore as deeply as I would have wanted during the summer school, because there's never time to do this. But I think the two elements are in a dialogue with one another in a sense.
That's absolutely right. Just parenthetically, building off of that, what is really interesting about fields such as climate history or history of disease or history of animals is how many of them rely on deep time perspectives in order to make sense. So Yersinia pestis, I understand from the some of the most recent work, is about 4,000 or 5,000 years old, so much older than that. I think this is the result of some of the latest. So the disease itself formed in a very particular Bronze Age environment. It spread around the world, well, in Asia, in a Bronze Age environment, exploded in the Justinianic world. Then we had the second and third pandemics. That history makes much, much more sense when we put it together in its entirety, rather than just pulling out
the 14th century episode.
The 14th century episode.
Yeah.
So it's a classic example. Again, I'm not saying you can't just do that, but that you have to be aware of the longer one. Same for climate history. In other words, that what is rich about climate history is, and its relationship with civilizations comes from the literature that has looked at complex societies over the last 5,000 years, and where the medieval simply becomes one of the many interesting data points in a longer survey. So there, the concern really is about this 500 to 1500 period, which again, I think is just, why people are doing this just because it's a legacy of, we have all these medieval historians around, we don't know what to do with them now, so we'll generate medieval history. Just release the medieval part of the story, just that I'm interested in the early history, and don't be bound by 550. Again and again in the scholarship, what I would see people saying is, oh, we don't insist on the 500. They sometimes use the word 300. But what you get is this, we're going to occasionally kind of look like that over our shoulder, what's going on back there. Again, that's the deep historian we can blame.
Yeah.
But I've been fighting that battle for maybe 20 years now.
Just a curiosity, how global is medieval global scholarship? Would be these discussions about heuristics of connected and comparative history proper to Chinese or Japanese historians, or this is a problematics that is important for medieval European and American scholars, but is not very important for other scholarships of the world?
Oh, it really varies. And one of the difficulties here, if one is doing a survey, is that the people that I meet are by definition the ones who have come to the Medieval Academy or come to places that I go, or alternatively might have invited me, but I'm not as often meeting the people who are concerned about European epistemological imperialism. The ones who want to avoid being medievalized won't be visible. I know it's particularly the case of New World scholarship. They invariably reject medieval. So people who work in the Americas never ever use medieval. Curiously, they use ancient.
Yeah. The dynamic of ancient and medieval is very interesting. In Japanese history, the ancient period, the Heian period, is actually, strictly speaking, medieval, and also in Chinese history. So that's why the pre-modern is tempting, because the pre-modern includes ancient and deep history, and somehow it only acknowledges this rupture of European hegemony that brings modernity at various points in time elsewhere in the world. But you're right that it then gets sort of fixated on this particular moment of change and tends to neglect or to flatten the others, the previous ones, into a pre-time.
Do you speak about Japanese and Chinese history written by European scholars, or
No.
about Japanese and Chinese history written by scholars of this region?
So the idea of working on the global Middle Ages is actually taking off in China and Korea, in Japan, as far as I know. But around problems, as Enzo was saying. For example, research around the Mongol Empire, which is not the 500, 1500 chronology at all. It's a very specific moment in time. That is a truly global global scholarship, with scholars working on it from very different countries and university systems, and not only scholars who have been trained in Western universities. So there's no doubt that that is, or Indian Ocean history, for example, which is now quite lively, is certainly practiced elsewhere in this sort of connected way. Then this said, of course, universities in the West tend to be better funded, richer, so that there are inequalities that still exist, right? And there are political circumstances in countries like China or, I don't know, Russia. So, yeah. But this is what I know about certain anecdotal, examples of, connected Middle Ages or global Middle Ages. And they really don't call it global Middle Ages that much. It's sort of research on the Mongol Empire. It's not necessarily about the global Middle Ages, but it's de facto. Whether in Iran there are scholars who study the Ilkhanids, and is considering how isolated the Iranian university network is from other Europe, I don't know. Yeah, so.
I had a, this is about Africa, not about East Asia, but I had a conversation with a colleague. I won't name her in case I misquoted her, but because I did ask her, what is it, she's an archaeologist, I said, what is it like being invited as the star of the Legal African Archaeologist? She says, frankly, I still find it perplexing. I'm happy to get invitations to talk about my work, but I don't understand the part about the people. So she was very open to the idea. She was quite against it because it's great to share your work.
Yeah, it's great to be included, though. It's not a small thing. It's great to communicate your research to audiences that normally do not listen to it. Okay. If there is no final burning desire to ask a question, then I think we've done justice as far as this afternoon goes to Dan's wonderful paper. I thank you very much for coming. Thank you also, Piero Gastaldo, who's just joined us.
Just mentioned it. Very nice meeting.
No problem. Since Piero Gastaldo and Elisabetta Ballai are here, and also Enzo, I want to thank you personally for the opportunity to fund this project and to have such interesting guests and discussions in Turin. For me personally, for the opportunity to spend time in Turin, a city I fell in love with, I must say, I confess. And finally, another big thanks to Dan for this wonderful paper and for spending time with us in this very cold May of 2024.